All right. Hello and welcome to the Sexually Satisfied Woman. I am your host, Eva Blake. And in this interview series, I'm talking to a variety of experts uniquely qualified to discuss some of the most common challenges that women face in our sexuality. Over the course of this series, we're going to offer real practices to boost your confidence, ditch the shame, and create truly passionate and authentic intimacy so that you can have the sexual satisfaction that you deserve. Today, I'm talking with Ellen Heed, a certified sexological bodyworker and a doctor of philosophy in somatic and spiritual psychology. She was a dancer from ages 3 to 30. Then she dove headlong into the practices of yoga, bodywork, and craniosacral therapy. She has taught anatomy, physiology, and hands-on techniques to thousands of somatic practitioners worldwide. I'm one of them. And as a certified sexological bodyworker, she treats scar tissue from genito-pelvic injuries. She is currently developing a training for professionals and body-aware individuals, specifically on scar tissue remediation called the STREAM training. Welcome, Ellen Heed. I'm so glad to talk with you today.
It's so good to see you, Eva. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. So I was one of your students back in 2011. Decades ago, practically. And your teaching, besides being so thorough and engaging, is also deeply reverent of the human body. And I remember you speaking about the interacting systems of the pelvis in such a beautiful way, from eliminating fluids to engorging and arousal. And you used words like elegant and refined. And it really made me appreciate the work of sexological bodywork even more, because we can be so widely focused and so pinpoint specific focused, right? Thinking about big sexual pleasure and expression and being as big as we can in that space, but also really focusing on nuanced pelvic floor healing and realignment. So I want to go big and go really deep with you today.
Let's do it.
Great. So when I go to your website, the first thing it says is embodied autonomy. So what is that and why do we need it?
Okay, thank you. Embodied autonomy, I got the idea of embodied autonomy from the notion in sexological bodywork of sexual autonomy. In my first sexological bodywork training in 2007, where I was a student, I remember our leader, Joseph Kramer, talking about sexual autonomy. And that was such a wild idea to me at that time. I was like, wait a minute, you mean my sexuality belongs to me? It's not dependent on somebody else? Holy cow. What does that mean? Whoa. It was just like this huge paradigm shift. Like, it belongs to me. Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Yes.
So I started talking to people about sexual autonomy, and then I realized they didn't have any agency over their body as a whole. It wasn't just their sexual body they didn't have autonomy with, in terms of ownership, agency, sovereignty, all those words that are so important to us right now. They didn't have agency over their body at all. It belonged to the medical profession, or some piece of it belonged to their primary scenario, how they grew up between their mom and their dad. Pieces of it got lost along the way to trauma and to illness and to injury. And people didn't feel like they had a right to own or have relationship with themselves in a meaningful way, like they could actually take responsibility for their health. Well, that responsibility got placed at the feet of so many other institutions and professionals. And I was raised in the 70s and the 60s, quite a long time ago, when it was about self-help. Back in the day when your body, yourself, it was like, what can we do as people with vulvas, women, people identify as women, to be self-helpers and take care of our own body and our own, sexual pleasure wasn't much of the conversation. Then it was more about sexual health. But it's all of it. It's health, it's pleasure, it's embodiment. It's that we own our own lives and experience.
Right.
How can we take responsibility for our whole health is really the question.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. So then how do sexological body workers help with that process? What is the significance of our particular field, our work in the world?
Wonderful. So, sexological body workers empower people to take ownership of their sexuality by saying, by the very nature of the professional relationship, that we don't take our clothes off. We wear gloves. There are super strict and particular hygiene protocols. So right away, it's not clinical. It's very much we are working with, we're mirroring, we're talking to, we're listening to the body, we're working with breath, we're encouraging people as much as possible to have their own experience on the table. We may be facilitating that experience, but a person learns that they can uh, fulfill their embodied potential
Mm.
through us reflecting, yes, this belongs to you. I'm not doing this for you. You're generating it. You're leading. We even go so far as to practice something called a bossy massage, where if the person isn't asking for what they want, we stop touching.
Right.
And right away, somebody learns, oh, yeah, I could actually ask to have my body touch the way I want it. And there's such a prohibition against that in our minds. Like we're waiting
Right.
for somebody to guess the magic formula to unlock our arrows.
Right.
No, we have to be so familiar with what we like that we can unlock our own and bring it as a
Right.
gift into relationship with another person, or more particularly, as a gift to ourselves.
Yeah, beautiful. And for some people it is a mind blowing up experience, like you mentioned, like, oh, this is mine. I get this power. Wow, I never knew that, or no one ever told me that. And for other people that I've worked with, sometimes that bossy massage or the you're not just going to take me on a journey is very frustrating, and
Uh,
it raises a lot of internal conflict.
It's very
Um
confronting.
Say again?
It's very confronting.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Because we're confronted exactly with these notions that you just talked about, right? What is mine, and what are you going to be responsible for me?
Right. Well, we've been socialized to believe that what we were just talking about, really, we don't take responsibility for even having a body. It
Right.
gets to very deep existential questions very quickly, like, I didn't ask to be born. How come I have to deal with all this, right? But here we are. Here we are in the meat puppet package, right? We may as well make the most of it while we're here. But if we're going to rely on somebody else to second guess what we like, what we want, what we need, we're setting ourselves up for continual disappointment rather than actually taking that journey on our own behalf. That's
Yeah.
really the possibility of what sexological bodywork in the best sense can offer, rather
Mhm.
than, going fishing and handing somebody experience after experience, fish after fish. The concept is to teach them to fish. Like, how do I
Mhm.
get to know what I like? How do I get to
Mhm.
give that to myself? What are the techniques? What are the tips? What are the pathways in? And how can I take full advantage of my own hands, my own nervous system, and learn to
Mhm.
surf it as a system rather
Yeah.
than, you know, I'm just going to lay here and wait for it to be over with. I'm going to wait for something to happen, right? And wondering that
Right.
there's so many of them who don't even know if they've ever had an orgasm. They don't
Mhm.
even know because nobody told them, and they're having
Mhm.
sensations, but they don't know how to frame or identify what's actually
Mhm.
happening in their body. They don't even know the tipping point because they haven't. We learn socially. And I'm not saying we
Right.
should have sex socially necessarily, but if we don't learn, if we're trying to learn sex all by ourselves and we're reading a book, that's too abstract. We actually need the mirroring and the conversation and the social engagement aspect of sexuality, but in an educational way. And that hasn't, until sexological bodywork came along, been available. Socially engaged sexual learning. You
Mhm.
can talk about it with your therapist till the cows come home. But that's
Right.
not the same as somebody who's touching your actual clitoris while you're talking about it. That's a whole different level. But somebody who's not, you don't have stakes with them, whether you do or don't have an orgasm. It's just an open ended exploration of what's possible with your body in this moment. And it's very rare. It's very new, actually. Even
Mhm.
though sexological bodywork's been around since 2003,
Mm-hmm.
still this concept of an open-ended exploration of sexuality is like people are, huh? I don't have to get
Right.
nowhere. I don't have to do something. I don't have to
Right.
perform.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea that, me as a practitioner in some ways, well, in many ways, I am here for you, right? And also you are the leader. And
Yes.
so that's a real mind fuck, if you will,
Uh-huh.
because in so many ways in our culture we're taught that somebody else leads and we follow,
Yes.
where we really have to pivot, we have to shift, we have to really think about, yes, what do I want and how can I communicate it? Even if it just falls out really wonky and doesn't make any sense the first few times around, right?
It's like
But
learning to talk, right?
mhm,
We're learning the language of our body. And
mhm,
some people, as we dive ever deeper into media, social media, screens, computers, the digital world, we're losing our self language for our body.
mhm,
So we don't even know how to take leadership when it comes to communicating our wants, needs, desires sexually, because we've let a machine take the lead. We're
yeah,
following prompts on a screen. So,
right.
what are the prompts when in a sexual situation, especially if both people have given their autonomy to the screen, right?
Mhm, mhm,
It's bizarre, but more and more I see this happening in people under the age of 40. There's just this confusion around where does the screen stop and my body begin? And so little real understanding that we exist apart from the screen.
mhm,
There are people who've been
mhm,
born with a device in their hands. They're playing
mhm,
with it before they can talk, before they can walk. And so there very little kind of awareness of what
mhm,
this nervous system is and does without the mediation of a device, actually.
right. I feel like we could have a whole other conversation about just that piece, about the orientation, not just to the screen, but to the light and to the activity that happens on the screen and how we, get hooked in with our own emotions and then all the chemicals, the oxytocins and must have it, and then just the habit of checking in back and forth day to day and how that takes up so much time that we kind of are tuned out to a lot of other things, not just in our environment, but like, do I need to use the bathroom? And am I feeling turned on? And am I hungry or am I thirsty? Some of those most basic, uh, physical nudgings that we have, those basic signs. But I really want to spend some time with you diving into scar tissue remediation because this is your specialty. This is where I learned this part from you, and you wrote your dissertation on this subject: women's sexual pain after childbirth, development of a somatic model for scar tissue remediation, education, and management. 500 pages. Wow. So, um, can you explain how scar tissue affects the body, but then specifically, how does it affect our sexuality and sexual pleasure?
Thank you for asking. It's so important because this is something that is often ignored, which is why I dove in and went to the effort to write a dissertation about it because there wasn't enough conversation about it at the time
Mhm.
I started um, diving in. I had an experience with a fellow sexological bodyworker who came to me with scar tissue in her pelvic floor and sexual pain. And she was mystified by it, really
Mm.
angry, really confused. Like, what the heck? Nobody told me this would happen as a result of having a baby. And I had no awareness of it really at that time. But we realized rather quickly that a little bit of body work, sexological body work, could go a long way toward relieving her pain and turning her back into the sexual dynamic person she was
Mhm.
prior to childbirth. So she had thought that her sexuality was all over because
Mm.
of the amount of pain she was having with penetration.
Mm.
And it turned out she had quite a lot of scar tissue. She had a second and or third degree tear and I could feel actual hard, wiry little bits of scar in her inside her vagina. And Her whole perineum was a little twisted and disfigured and
Mm-hmm.
still holding a lot of bruising, even 3 months postpartum. She was shocked. I was shocked. I'd never seen that before. I hadn't worked with anyone that close to birth. She's just 3 months after. And I was like, whoa, how can somebody still be holding so much stagnant blood and bruising in their perineum
Mm.
3 months after childbirth? And after one session, we cleared it up in the session. All the bruising went away, all the configuration. Her vagina actually looked like it was sideways. It was like sideways wide and not very tall. And
Mm-hmm.
so it became, normal, longer than it was wide. And all
Wow.
the bruising stopped. We watched it clear in real time with a little bit of massage.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, holy cow, she's a very gifted, very embodied person who really could give me cues about what was feeling right and how to, oh, right there, press harder or more
Mm-hmm.
oil or whatever she needed. She was able to speak, right? Because she had been trained deeply. She was an assistant in my sexological bodywork training. She's years ahead of me in her own sexual embodiment and autonomy, and utilized that to be able to direct me, to give her what she knew she needed. But neither one of us even knew what was possible when we started. So that was a long time ago. That was back in 2009. Then in 2010, we started to actually research with a lot of other women. We wanted to make a training around this for people. We were way ahead of our time. Nobody was even having that conversation then. So we did work with 12 women, and the work with 12 women became the subject of my dissertation. So I realized you don't just you don't need to be a sexological body worker with advanced erotic autonomy
Mm-hmm.
in order to direct someone. Every one of those women knew what they needed and wanted. When we got into the weeds with them around what was happening biochemically, what was happening biomechanically, what was happening emotionally, all of those things had an effect on scar tissue. And those are the domains, the dimensions of healthy sexuality and healthy embodiment. What goes on biochemically, what goes on
Mm-hmm.
biomechanically. So what's going on in our skin, how our muscles hold up our bones, what's going on with the way emotions are trapped in our tissues, all affect
Mm-hmm.
how quickly scars can resolve.
Mm-hmm.
At the center of my research was an issue of what I call somatic recall, which is where we have a cognitive story of what happened. I went to
Mm-hmm.
the hospital, I had my baby, and everything turned out all right in the end. Even though it was a hospital transfer, I wanted a home birth, I got a C-section. That was not what I planned. And I've had postpartum depression afterwards. I'm healthy, my baby's healthy, and everything's okay. That would be the cognitive narrative. But
Right.
then to put your hands onto the C-section scar and one hand on the scar outside the skin, and the other hand inside the vagina to the backside of the scar, sandwiching that scar between your fingers to let the body speak. What does the body remember about that experience? And it's often extremely different material than the cognitive story, which is everything okay, it came out okay in the end, and it's all good.
Mm-hmm.
And the body says, no, it's not all good. There was that
Right.
moment when I thought I was going to die during the home birth, and when we knew I needed to make that hospital transfer.
Right.
And I was afraid for myself. I was afraid for my baby. That terror is still embedded in the
Mm-hmm.
body. And sometimes it's actually embedded in the scar itself.
Mm-hmm.
So scars have a narrative. And
Mm-hmm.
that was fascinating to me. I had no idea. Nobody had ever written anywhere about
Mm-hmm.
scars having a narrative. People talk about physical trauma, but I was actually watching scar tissue change its configuration in real time
Mm-hmm.
when the difference between the cognitive narrative and the scar narrative was illuminated in session in real time. Suddenly, oh, there's a tear. I was feeling
Mm-hmm.
terrified. And then the scar literally goes blah, 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 and lets go. What
Mm-hmm.
is that? There's nothing in
Right.
physiology that explains our body's capability of doing that very thing.
Right. I've been in that a similar situation where someone talks about my childbirth and it was okay, and then as soon as we actually start spending time with the scar, it is, it's waterworks, and then it really is then, the person is actually saying something totally different. I lost all this time and they didn't ask me and they just gave me the C-section and no one told me. And, and how devastating that is, right? So then this person now is really able to grapple with the stuff that wasn't in that story, right? All the stuff that was hidden, but yet
Yes.
really needs to come out both emotionally and then allows the body to be softer and more mobile. And, she reported the next day, like, I could dance and it felt better,
Right. Right.
right?
I recovered my sense of my pelvis. I have one now. Before, it could have been completely offline. Offline, it was the result of jumping out of your body due to the trauma of nobody told me and I lost all this time and I didn't understand what was happening and I felt railroaded. Where was my choice? And I felt helpless and I felt hopeless. Helpless, hopeless
Right.
equals trauma. Trauma means we dissociate. When we dissociate, we may not reassociate
Right.
until somebody touches that part of our body again. And this is so much
Right.
the case with scar tissue in the pelvic floor. But the implications for sexuality is that if we checked out, sexuality is not necessarily going to bring us back.
Right.
What brings us back is the attention to the present moment of what the tissue has to say. And often, especially after children, sex is a little bit hurried. There's not a lot of privacy. There are the needs of the kids. And then there's 10,000 things, right? Oh, did I take the clothes out of the dryer? What do I need? We're out of cream. I need to go get, I ran out of potatoes, whatever. These things are going around in people, especially in women's heads when they're
Yeah.
having duty sex after birth because it never felt the same after because nobody listened to her body to let the birth be fully processed. So I think, birth is a huge experience, a huge transition for so many women. And without taking time to listen to the body after the birth and let the body reveal its particular version, the somatic version of the story, not the head version, the body version. It has to integrate. The head and the body then can go meet in the middle and say, oh, yes, the cognitive story is true and the embodied story is
Right.
true. And that really needs to be honored and it needs to be felt by the person whose body it is, right? So this is a
And
piece of autonomy.
mhm. And to just, swing back to what we were saying earlier about sexological body work and how our boundaries are so clear,
Mm.
right? That one of the things I think that we have done really well, or at least I learned really well in sexological body work and make a big effort in with my clients is really being walking through safety, creating a safe environment, but also being available to nudge a little forward, right? Because we want people to press into a place that is that maybe could feel risky, right? In order to have that release or that next level of learning, right? But we have to do that in a way where they ultimately feel safe, right? That space where when we're touching the body in these ways between the scars, there's this safety, I think, that we create that says it's okay to find a way to let go, whether that is the talking self or the physical self that finally relaxes after so many years and decades sometimes.
It can. It can be decades. I worked with women who had their children 50 years ago. They were in
Mm,
their 70s, still having sexual pain, had sexual pain ever since childbirth. It's a lot of years of sexual pain that get
mhm,
encoded in the nervous system. But then having that opportunity to remember there was this moment when my birth, when my OB winked at my husband and said, "This stitch is for you." And I never got over that because I didn't feel like he
mm,
was even seeing me as a human being. It was all
mhm,
about my husband and for him. And it was my body that was being altered by that husband's knot
mm,
during an episiotomy. So, wow, quite a lot. Or a stitch, a pelvic floor repair. Oftentimes there'll be a little manipulation of the shape, the size, the conformation of the vaginal opening, which can create quite a lot of pain for the person who's receiving the stitches.
mhm.
So yes, the body's narrative. And I wanted to say something else about sexological bodywork in that we will tell people what we're doing before we do it. What
Right.
novel concept. I mean, how many
Right.
people go to the gynecologist for an exam? Now they say, I'll put the speculum in. But when I was coming up, no, they just put it in and it was icy cold and it never felt good. This is kind of awful.
Yeah.
Embodied shock from from a routine
Right.
exam.
Right. We could tell an hour's worth of stories. I'm flashing on several of mine, but speaking of doctors, what is it that doctors or more mainstream professionals are missing when it comes to postpartum sexuality and sexual pleasure, and specifically around scar tissue?
Sorry, I have to laugh.
Yeah,
What are doctors missing? They're missing an education in the mechanics of arousal for female bodies. Period. They don't ever even learn that. They learn
I
the
know.
pathology, they don't learn the pleasure. So, how can they possibly engage and instruct people about what's possible for them postpartum when they never talk about what's possible at all? There's just this
Right.
normal. Is sex painful? Nobody talks about the mechanics of lubrication. Nobody talks about the phases of arousal that are required. Like it could take an hour to get fully lubricated, and often does for most women. An hour of foreplay.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Wow. A doctor could say that this is normal. They could normalize female
Right.
sexuality, but I don't want to get into conspiracy theory here. I swear this is the mechanics of patriarchy to not let women know about how their arousal works. So they can be controlled via an unsatisfying or ungratifying sex life.
Mm-hmm.
Because a
Mm-hmm.
sexually empowered woman, and gets very much to the heart of what you're doing here through this series of interviews you're conducting, is what does it mean when women can own the power of their sexuality? It's a giant social experiment that
Yes.
we're waiting with bated breath to see the results of. And I'm fully amazed and so delighted that you're undertaking this project. It's so important. We need this conversation.
Mhm. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So if we think specifically about this element of recovering the body, right? I have a friend who had a child more than 3 years ago, and she recently told me, a month or so ago, my body just still doesn't feel right. How
Yeah.
how can she explore her own body to assess, is this scar tissue? Do I have a pelvic injury? What would she be looking for with her eyes? What would she be able to see? And what would she be able to feel with her hands?
So, if there's been a C section, it's very obvious to see the scar from the C section. That's easy to observe. If there's been an episiotomy, in other words, her
Mhm.
perineum was snipped with scissors in order to enlarge the vaginal opening for the baby to come out, she can sometimes see the tiny little episiotomy scar in the perineum. It's not always visually obvious. If there's been a vaginal tear, it's less likely that she'll be able to see anything, although it's really useful for women to take a picture, an actual photograph. This is a good use of your iPhone, to take a picture of your pelvic floor prior to birth so you remember, because things may not be the same after. One
Mm,
labia may be high and tilted that it wasn't
mhm.
before. Is there something that's causing that labial tilt, and could it be scar tissue? And often it is. So if things don't look the same, everything kind of lined up symmetrically. Let's say there's this sort of a relationship, and let's say there's pain over, if this is the vaginal opening, there's pain over here with penetration. You could actually take a finger inside and feel along.
Mhm.
You can feel your the the pubic arch, which are the bones that come from the bottom of the pubic symphysis, where the two pelvic bones come together in the middle. The pubic arch comes like a V, an upside down V, down from that. You can feel the bones on either side of the pubic arch, just putting your finger inside and pushing up at like 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock if your vagina is a clock. Typically, what I find is there's less tissue on one side after birth, and that tissue, it's like the tissue itself gets squished out of the way when the baby comes through,
Mm, mhm.
and sometimes torn in the process. And if there's less padding, then penetration can be painful in that 11 o'clock position, and you could feel that with your own fingers. That would be an exploration, is to actually see, oh, it's puffy and padded over here. Oh, not so much padding over here.
Mm-hmm.
Other things that people could feel for: tight, wiry, or hard little balls of dense tissue somewhere inside their vagina, and sometimes in the perineum. If you go to the bottom edge of the vagina and feel around there, you could feel where there's been a tear repair, because the tissue feels silky and with silky continuity as you rub around the introitus, the entrance of the vagina. But when you get to a scar, suddenly that silkiness is interrupted with tissue that feels dense and hard. What women can do about that for themselves is take a little castor oil and massage that, sometimes one finger in and one finger out. And they're on their perineum and they're doing this little massage motion that actually pushes the castor oil into the tissue and helps the body to dissolve the scar tissue, because
Mm-hmm.
scars can be dissolved, but the body needs certain chemical information.
Mm-hmm.
In order for that to happen, castor oil happens to supply a good amount of that chemical information.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. It's so amazing, if we learn the things that we can do for ourselves, right? I mean, all of these things that you just mentioned, exploration for ourselves, and also when we work with someone else as like a sexological body worker, how we can go even further, even deeper, and being able to have that reflection, like, this is normal, or this is really common, and this is what I'm feeling. I can feel something change or move, right? And I love the way that you describe, just the word silky, right? It opens up something new for me, right? Which is different than like wet or lubricated. That there's a different quality to that, which I think is just so valuable in the words that you use. So you're creating this stream program, right? Tell us a little bit about what it is, who it's for, but are you going to be teaching these specific techniques that you just talked about to the professionals that need to know this material, so that we can have a bigger, better conversation about women's sexuality and sexual satisfaction in this world?
We
Yeah.
can and should. So, STREAM stands for Scar Tissue Remediation, Education, and Management. It's kind of a mouthful, but it also says what it is this is for. Scar tissue exists, and I realized this when I was writing my dissertation. Like, all right, what am I going to call this thing at the end of it? And I realized it's not just about scars. It's not just about education about scars. It's not just about remediation, it's also about
Mhm.
management, because some scars are not going to go away. Like a C-section scar will
Mhm.
never, ever completely disappear. It can change its form quite dramatically, but you'll always have that incision line that's barely visible when it's in its best state. Some women who've had C-sections, I can barely even find their scars. That's a
Mhm.
well-resolved scar. But if a scar, let's say it's thick, there's a keloid, it's dense, and the belly
Mhm.
pushes over that C-section scar, that is a restriction. That means that that scar is grown through deeply and attached to the pubic bone. That has a whole other effect on sexuality, which is what I'll be teaching in the stream training, is how scars literally shut down sexuality. And then the techniques for liberating the tissue, so there it's no longer compressed or without adequate blood supply, nerve supply, or lymphatic drainage. Those are all aspects of what happens when scars affect our physiology. It's a lot of theory. There's a lot of anatomy. There's a lot of hands-on technique, and this program I'm doing is for professionals mainly who have scope of practice to touch the pelvic floor, and people who would like to have scope of practice to touch the pelvic
Mhm.
floor and are willing to work with waivers and other kinds of agreements with their clients, that they're willing to have this work done, because gynecologists don't do this
Mm. Mhm.
and they don't know how to do it. It's not part of their training. Scar tissue is a massive blind spot in medicine,
Mhm.
because of the liability implied if you're doing the surgeries. It will make a scar. The tissue has to approximate.
Right.
That's called a scar by definition. How healthy that scar is, how resilient that scar is, that's the work that's part of the work that I'm interested in creating, is resiliency in a scar rather than stiffness, numbness,
Mm-hmm.
pain, and dysfunction. So, teaching people what's necessary to create a healthy body, to create a healthy scar, is part of the educational aspect. Hands on technique is also part of an educational aspect. And then understanding all of the things that we can use passively: castor oil, clay, massage, heat, working with massage tools to actually soften the scar. There are loads of techniques that can be used. So there's a tips and techniques aspect to the training. So, and it goes on for quite a while. It's a 2-year training
Mm.
because it takes that long to actually absorb the information and learn what you're about in a way where you
Mm-hmm.
can really deliver service and understand what happens to create the conditions for a scar to resolve and what happens and why when a scar will not resolve.
Mm.
Yeah, so you need to
Beautiful.
understand all of it.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much, Ellen Heed. It's always inspiring for me to sit with you, to learn from you. There are so many new things that I get, even when you are reviewing something that I've already learned from you. I get a new flash of inspiration. So thank you very much. For everyone else, please come back tomorrow for another expert conversation. And goodbye. We'll see you then.
Bye, Eva. It's been lovely.
Thank you so much.